Welcome to INSA's Ensuring Supply Chain Integrity in 5G and Other Critical Systems. I now like to play a video from our sponsor, GDIT.
We are GDIT, the thinkers, innovators, and mission experts, supporting some of the most complex government, defense, and intelligence projects across the country, delivering the cloud, artificial intelligence, and cyber solutions that ensure today is secure and tomorrow is smarter. Co-creating with more than 90 tech partners to move the mission forward. GDIT, delivering the art of the possible.
I now like to welcome INSA President Suzanne Wilson-Heckenberg.
Suzanne, please activate your microphone.
Pardon me. I hope you all can hear me now. Deputy Director for National Intelligence for NCSC. Connie, thank you for making time to be here today. Before we get started, a few housekeeping rules that I would like to go over. If you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. With over 650 attendees today, please be patient. We would love to get to your questions. It's great if you can also identify yourself with your name and your organization. We are pleased to welcome so many members of the press for the panel this afternoon. This is a reminder that this program is on the record. And finally, I would like to thank both of our sponsors this afternoon, Exeger Federal Solutions and GDIT, for their critical support of this program. We could not deliver this kind of expert insight without the support of our sponsors. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Brigitte Custer, Vice President and Chief Technology Officer for GDIT's Intel and Homeland Security Division. Brigitte will introduce our keynote speaker. Brigitte, over to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. On behalf of GDIT, I would like to thank INSA for holding today's discussion. As a long-standing service provider supporting our customers' critical missions, GDIT understands that with the emergency of 5G technology, both agencies and our nation's citizens need a trusted provider, one who can help our national security partners make today secure and leverage the technology of tomorrow to gain strategic advantage over our adversaries. Let's now shift our focus and zoom into the mission space, specifically the National Counterintelligence and Security Center at the DNI. This is where our keynote speaker, the Deputy Director, both operates and thrives. She has a long-standing and honorable career in government service. She spent more than 17 years working in U.S. missions in Asia, including U.S. embassies in China and Japan, the American Institute in Taiwan, and the U.S. Consulate in Hong Kong, both before and after the territories transitioned to Chinese rule. Prior to her government career, which began in the mid-'80s, she worked at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York City. Now, would it surprise you that she has an aptitude for languages? In fact, a fluency in many, to include Chinese Mandarin. It's with great respect and gratitude that I introduce today the Deputy Director, Ms. Connie Taub.
Thank you, Brigitte, and thank you to GDIT for your support this afternoon. Connie, I've enjoyed having the opportunity to talk to you over the past couple of days in preparation for your keynote. And I'm hoping you can define what the threat is for our virtual attendees this afternoon.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you very much to you and to all of your INSA colleagues for giving me the opportunity today to talk about this topic, which has really very much come into its own in 2020. Let me first also extend my thanks to the very generous, for the very generous introduction that that Brigitte extended as well. So what a nice way to start an afternoon to talk about a topic which, as I say, has become, has rolled off our tongue in a way in 2020 that it has not in the past. Let me start with putting this into strategic perspective. The 2020 National Counterintelligence Strategy, signed by the President in January, which our organization puts together every few years and which we did this year in coordination with the interagency, highlights this year 5 key areas that are under specific threat from foreign adversaries. Threats to the key U.S. supply chains are one of the pillars of this strategy, highlighting just how important this topic is. Until recently, addressing the supply chain, the topic of supply chain vulnerabilities was indeed, to any audience, deeply esoteric and required significant explanation. During this past year, however, the COVID crisis has provided the perfect illustration to the American people who have so poignantly learned the dangers of maintaining such heavy reliance on one supplier in a critical area. In this case, of course, it was in the health security area as a result of the COVID crisis. So a spotlight has been placed this year upon the issue of supply chain vulnerabilities, and indeed on one of the key foreign actors involved in bringing this threat to U.S. government, U.S. persons, and U.S. companies. The fact of the matter is, U.S. adversaries are seeking to compromise the integrity, the trustworthiness, and the authenticity of products and services purchased by and integrated into the operations of the U.S. government, the defense industrial base, and the private sector. They do this in order to collect information, to augment their own economic and national security positions, as well as to develop a capability to disrupt or degrade U.S. capabilities, all of which are essential to the functioning of U.S. security, of our economy, of our public health and public safety. The telecoms and information technology sectors are 2 key infrastructure sectors that are held at risk by this determination by our foreign adversaries to carry out supply chain attacks. So clearly, knowing the adversary's intent to take advantage of any vulnerabilities, it is critical for any organization leadership to develop trust in the security of their supply chains, especially as it relates to their core capabilities. Equally clearly, while ensuring the integrity of any organization's supply chain is critical, it is also extremely challenging, particularly given the attributes of our modern society and our modern economy. Developing and maintaining a clear understanding of the nature of any organization's supply chain in a real way in the modern world is a very heavy lift. Globalization and outsourced manufacturing creates multiple geographic and virtual international borders in the supply chain life cycle. Additionally, the complexity of corporate architecture in the modern world further complicates these issues, particularly given the extensive international investment and hybrid ownership structures that characterize our modern economy. Moreover, further complicating the challenges that organizational leaders have, the global supply chain is only one part of a very, very challenging threat landscape. Our adversaries conduct blended operations that fuse cyber efforts, malicious insiders, among other means, with supply chain operations. Each attack vector augments the work of the other, and each offers means to further the overall attack. So given all the complexities and especially due to the extent globalization has taken root over the last couple of decades, I think it's fair to say that supply chain risk can probably never be entirely eliminated, but rather supply chain risk must be managed. Because I never like to lay out a threat without some form of reassurance that there are people who have thought hard about these threats, as no doubt many of you in this audience have done, and pulled out some best practices, I thought I'd very quickly lay out what you may want to be thinking about as an organizational leader, as you look at how to yourself manage this risk, since it is probably not entirely eliminatable, if I can use that word. So first and foremost, recognize and accept that this risk exists. Establish a process, a risk management process to enhance trust in the purchases of goods and services that your organization employs on a daily basis. Keep in mind that supply chain risk management is very much a team sport, not unlike cybersecurity, which is another risk factor that you and your organizations have no doubt been managing for many years now. This team perhaps is led by a chief risk officer or a chief strategy officer, but it should absolutely involve your CIO, your chief information security officer, and very importantly, your acquisitions team, to give them what they need to prevent, detect, and deter any challenges that might exist or develop to your organization's secure supply chain. Forcing collaboration among these elements is critical. Ensuring that the work of these elements is perceived and serves as a critical mission function and not as a support function is also a recipe for success in terms of securing the supply chain. Finally, know your partners. As I mentioned earlier, it's not easy in this interconnected world to know your partner. You may know your partner today, and your partner may become someone else tomorrow. So this is an ongoing dynamic effort. Vet your third-party vendors, including your legal counsels. Understand their security practices. Set minimum security practices that they need to follow. Ask them the right hard questions before they provide you the goods or services. Reward employees for carrying out the due diligence before acquisitions are completed. And remember, as is the case in cybersecurity, diversity of suppliers is generally a good thing. I think we've learned that in the last month. Bottom line, do all you can to understand your partners and to carry out the due diligence you need to understand them in a dynamic fashion and reward your officers, your colleagues that are carrying out that work.
That's very helpful, Connie, the way you laid that out. I think it's very tangible for our audience to adapt to some of those steps. I'm curious, how does 5G factor in to this threat that we're talking about here today?
So let me talk a little bit about 5G, although I think that this audience, probably I don't need to go into any great depth on what the attributes are of 5G that make this so significant. I will, however, highlight a few things that I think I can underline as we talk about some of the specific organizations, particularly Huawei, that are of particular concern when it comes to the 5G issue. But as you all are well aware, as the next generation of 5G wireless technology, 5G has the real potential to have vast implications across the economy, ranging from artificial intelligence to manufacturing to public services, including electricity and transportation. In that way, it is quite significantly different than previous iterations of telecom services. Because it will introduce speeds that are 100 times faster than the existing 4G networks, as well as incredibly fast delay times up to a millisecond, and networks that are capable of connecting millions of new devices. The new technology will enable the Internet of Things in ways that don't exist today. The capabilities that 5G brings will increasingly blur the lines between the physical world and the virtual. Thus, it is more important than ever to secure what you're doing online and your data that resides online. So with all the advances and opportunities that 5G brings, so too does it bring vulnerabilities that go beyond what already exists with 4G and its predecessor networks. For example, some of the key technologies expected to underpin 5G, software-defined networking, network virtualization, and the transition of more core functions to the edge of the network create larger attack surfaces and more opportunities for data monitoring and for introducing vulnerabilities. So the bottom line is that 5G brings with it all kinds of exciting capabilities and opportunities, but at the same time, because of the way that it's structured and what it will deliver, also more vulnerabilities.
So how does the US government as a whole and NCSC manage and handle this risk?
So let me highlight a little bit, if I may. May I turn to Huawei at this time and talk a little bit about why Huawei is of particular concern?
Please do.
Because some of the ways that we have managed the risk, and to get to your question, are specific to the Huawei threat. And so I think it might make sense to lay out our concerns about Huawei as a company, as a deliverer of this 5G capability, because some of the actions that have been taken are specific to this company. And I will say, as a preview to what it is that we have done about this problem, that we've, in the past, I would say 2 or 3 years, we have really taken action, we being the US government and our partners, we've really taken action against this supply chain threat in a way that we haven't done heretofore. So what are the risks involved with this specific company named Huawei? As I mentioned before, supply chain risk management is not something that rolled off anybody's tongue until perhaps recently. And the organization that is most, if people were aware of a supply chain problem I would argue, in the last 8 or 10 years, the company Huawei would come to mind. So I think it's worth laying out what it is about Huawei, what it is that we expect in a telecoms provider, and what it is that Huawei is delivering. And I hearken back to a word that I used earlier, which is the word trust. The critical need for trust in a telecoms provider, especially when there are so many vulnerabilities that 5G will bring, as I just articulated, can't be overstated. And in short, the company Huawei epitomizes concerns about the dangers of networks that can be manipulated, disrupted, or controlled by authoritarian governments with no democratic checks or balances, no regard for human rights, privacy, or international norms. In so many ways, in short, Huawei simply does not engender trust. So here's some perspectives on what it is we need to trust about companies that provide us with telecoms access. Again, especially when 5G promises to transform our world on so many different levels. Countries, companies, and yes, citizens need to be able to trust that 5G equipment, software, and services will not threaten national security, privacy, economic sovereignty, intellectual property, or human rights. Trust cannot exist when a telecoms vendor is subject to the whims of an authoritarian government. Trust means that 5G and software companies are financed openly and transparently using standard best practices in procurement, investment, and contracting. Trust means that 5G equipment and software companies have transparent ownership, partnerships, and corporate governance structures. Trust means that 5G equipment and software companies exemplify a commitment to innovation, respect for intellectual property rights, and a history of ethical corporate behavior. Trust means that 5G equipment and software companies adhere to industry best practices on network security. And I think if we shore up the company of Huawei against all of those criteria, Huawei falls short. The record of Huawei, which has links to the PRC military, has been implicated in the PRC espionage world, has stolen intellectual property, is accused of corporate practices throughout the world. The fact that it is beholden to the PRC government because of the PRC's intelligence law, that it has no judicial recourse to resist that government overreach, that it has repeatedly stolen sensitive data and intellectual property from companies across the world, and indeed that it has a corporate policy of giving bonuses to its employees for theft. Huawei, with its history of unethical and illegal behavior, including IP theft, has simply not earned trust. And that's the basis on which the United States government has taken some very specific actions related to Huawei. But stepping back, we've also taken a number of actions which I think, when they are fully implemented, will place the US government, our industry partners, as well as taxpayers like you and me, in a much better position to have that trust in our supply chain for the critical elements of what government does. So on a strategic level, specifically focused on 5G, the government published the 5G, National 5G Strategy very recently, which aims to give us the opportunity to lead the way in developing, deploying, and managing both secure and reliable 5G communications infrastructure. As I mentioned earlier, our counterintelligence strategy also calls out supply chain risk management as a critical element that needs to be protected because of the foreign adversary threat against that process. We've also seen in the course of the last couple of years new laws that have been that are specifically focused on managing the supply chain effectively and securely, and then specifically also on some companies. The Secure Technology Act of 2018 established a council at the federal level to manage supply chain risk management. A law passed in 2019, just last year, Section 889 of NDAA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, singles out 5 companies that are problematic from a supply chain perspective, and indeed Huawei is one of those companies. There is a Section 6306 as well of NDAA, which creates an IC supply chain task force, which I chair and which we have just kicked into existence just a few months ago, as it has just come into existence. Again in March, the Secured 5G and Beyond Act of 2020 requires the president to develop a strategy. Strategy has come out. The Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act of 2019 ensures that telecoms equipment in the rural areas will be not only ripped and replaced, but also that funding will exist to do that. Rural areas are at risk because Huawei, thanks to their government funding, has been able to provide very inexpensive capabilities to the rural telecoms, which are generally speaking not a high profit area for telecommunications companies in the United States. Finally, with foreign partners, the US government has been working a Clean Networks program and has worked through something called the Prague Proposals to carry out with about 30 partners commitments to maintain clean networks and following the same perspectives on the understanding of supply chain risk management and an understanding of what the threats are to that. So as you see, a lot has gone on. There is an effort at stake within the federal government also to ensure that all of these different efforts are well coordinated, that they maintain the same standards. And that is something that I think will, because there has been so much activity, that will further augment where we are in this space at this time.
So I'm really pleased that you honed in on the Huawei threat early on in our conversation, because as some of our attendee questions are rolling in, several of them are about Huawei. So I think we've addressed those in the very beginning. Just to remind folks, we have a little over 15 minutes, and please submit your questions on the portal on the right-hand side of your screen. If you can, identify who you are and what organization you're with. So Connie, Sharon Halstead, first off, thanks you for joining us for this afternoon's programming. And she says that you have emphasized in the past intelligence, integration, and inclusion of all agencies and how important it is to protect our supply chain. She wants to know, what are the top 3 actions you would like to see from the community to increase integration?
So I would say that I've been very heartened over the last few years to see the developments at a agency by agency level of developing and first of all understanding this threat and developing capabilities to address it. I think we've moved very far forward working as a team, both within the IC and also integrating the IC's efforts and informing efforts of the other parts of government with that understanding of the supply chain threat.
That's helpful. So, we haven't had a virtual panel yet where there's not a question related to the pandemic. So this question comes from Priscilla, who is studying cyber at Mercyhurst University. And she wants to know what effects the pandemic has had on our supply chain here in the US, not just specific to 5G, but in general.
So I would argue, as I mentioned earlier, that ironically, what the pandemic has done for the concept of supply chain and for the discussions of the pros and cons of globalization have brought the discussions of those 2 issues to the fore and given people an opportunity to observe some of the downsides of supply chains that are not as diverse as perhaps they should be. As I mentioned earlier, in cybersecurity, we always want layered approaches to security. We always say that diversity is your friend. In supply chain issues, that concept is likewise valid. And I think what we have learned during the COVID crisis is that we are deeply integrated, so deeply integrated in terms of supply chains on critical areas that we may want to rethink and readjust maybe just a little bit to ensure that when we are in crisis periods, we are well positioned to get through the crisis without a reliance on partners that might not gain full trust.
That makes sense. So Betsy Meso asks, what sectors does the US face the greatest supply chain security threats? Obviously, we've talked about 5G. And how is US national security affected by each sector's vulnerabilities?
So that is a very good question indeed. And as you will see when you look at our 2020 National Counterintelligence Strategy, which I encourage all of you to look at, the 5 pillars of that strategy are in many ways interconnected. We don't put those pillars in any kind of order because they are all equally important. But one of those pillars is critical infrastructure. One of the pillars is the threat to US supply chains. I would argue that the supply chains that place us most at risk and therefore must be best protected are those that fall within the critical infrastructure areas. And as you know, those are telecoms, banking, energy, elections, because of the criticality of elections to our democratic process, and a number of, I put those as the highest, most important critical infrastructure sectors to address. But as you know, there are a number of other sectors that have specifically been highlighted as critical infrastructure that I would place in the same category. A lack of very strong supply chain management in those areas puts those critical infrastructure sectors at risk of attack by foreign adversaries, whether by cyber means, by insider threat challenges, or via a supply chain attack.
So moving on, Chris Swanson wants to know, given how important it is to trust telecom providers, how important is it to encourage US manufacturers to make 5G equipment so we don't have to rely on the Chinese or other foreign made equipment? Good question, Chris.
That is a very good question, and I think it is not the first time it's been asked. And I do, first of all, let me highlight that there are other vendors for 5G equipment. And I will say that that is something that was not very clear at the beginning of this conversation a few years ago. Indeed, Huawei has a one-stop shop for 5G equipment, but the other equipment, services, and software that make up 5G and other telecommunications systems exist. So there are existing vendors, but I don't disagree that in encouraging US vendors to continue to work in this space is something that is a very positive both development and goal. And I do believe that that is something that is shared by many across the US government.
Well, that is encouraging. So Jetta Breslow asked this afternoon, Connie, you mentioned the importance of trusting networks. Some senior US officials have warned that the US will have to learn to operate on dirty networks around the world that incorporate Chinese hardware. Can secure software get around the problem of potentially compromised hardware? And if so, how safe is the supply chain for this type of software?
So specifically with regard to the 5G, there is no way to operate safely on a network that is incorporating untrusted goods services. And therefore, you will see, if you're able to follow all of the actions that have been taken, that is why we have taken, the US government, specific actions against specific untrusted vendors, is because there is not comfort in operating on what you call dirty networks.
So this is a question from a student at Auburn University, where I believe they have some type of master's program in supply chain risk management now, but it's a hot area of employment. Are there any recommendations you have to grad or undergrads who want to enter this subject matter field?
So I am going to shamelessly push forth my own organization, which I do believe has been somewhat of a leader in this, along with our partners across government. We have materials that are up on our website, and I encourage you all to look at those. I'm thrilled that programs focused on this problem are popping up across the country. I don't think that would have happened, 10 years ago, when many of us were already aware that a company called Huawei might be problematic. And I think that this is a very good development. There is a lot of literature out there now on this topic. Again, I think 2020 is the year of supply chain. Maybe it started in 2019. So there is a lot of material out there to inform your work as a student in this area. Please include ours as well. We really, I think all across government, there is a lot of very good work that's been done, which is unclassified and can be shared with those who are pursuing this, I would say, relatively new field.
I think that's helpful guidance for folks who are looking to continue their education in this area. So Leah Meyer wants to know, what role, if any, do you envision blockchain-based solutions will play in securing and verifying the integrity of the U.S. government's critical systems supply chains?
Okay, so here I am going to pass on this question and just straight out admit that I don't have the technical background to give an answer to that would be any better than the one that the asker would have. Forgive me for that, Liam.
That's okay. It's fine to admit an area where you might not have the deepest expertise. So not everyone will do that. So this is from Megan Maloney, who is a consultant at Guidehouse. She thanks you for sharing your time today. And she would like to ask about information sharing. She says it seems that the IC has a tendency to balk at sharing threat assessments at times. Can you talk to us about the notion of a shared SCRIM repository and provide a status update of future outlook on the same?
So I am going to suggest that it's possible that Megan has established that SCRIM management program at Auburn University, because that is a superb question. And it gets at the very heart of the hardest thing from the intelligence community perspective, the hardest problem. Because once you solve the information sharing problem, and once you create a repeatable process whereby information that you have is shared broadly, then you no longer have a SCRIM management problem, because you've really sort of skinned that cat. We are in the process of working out a repeatable process that will inform not only those within small communities, but much more broadly. The intelligence community is in a space now where information that we have needs to be shared in a way that, when I grew up in the community, we weren't sharing. We are doing that. We're stepping out into that space. NCSC, the organization that our director and I run, are doing that every day. My being here is part of that. And it is something that we are learning as we go along. But what we know is that when we have threat information, it is worse to have it and not use it than it is to not have it. We're cognizant of that, and we are very carefully and mindfully working in the information sharing space. But Megan, you put your finger on the most challenging aspect of this, and I'll tell you the most fun, because we're breaking new ground.
Thank you for your candid response, Connie. So we have about 5 minutes left. I still have several questions from our attendees. Would encourage folks to keep those coming in. This question is from Paul Harink. He says, gaining information needed to determine risk of suppliers, particularly on third-party supply chain providers, is challenging to obtain at times. What, if any, laws, procurement guidelines, or other related efforts are underway to support the U.S. government's ability to vet these vendors and obtain the information from industry? And Paul is from LMI. Thanks, Paul.
Paul, thank you very much for that good question. Indeed, as I mentioned earlier, the globalization and the intricate relationships and buyouts and investment by foreign organizations into companies in the United States and across the world make it very, very challenging to understand where we are with our supply chain, with the organizations that are feeding into our supply chains. Depending upon where you sit, it is more or less challenging to carry out the due diligence that you need to do in order to carry out that, have that real strong understanding and that strong trust that I referred to earlier. There are, to the extent that there are regulations or laws that get in the way of various organizations having that understanding, the government will look at those. I'm not, at the moment, I'm not working on anything along those lines, but I'd be very interested in hearing specifically after this conversation of what it is that you have in mind that is holding back these efforts.
So Grant Allard wants to know, what are your thoughts on China Export and Credit Insurance Corp as a tool of the Chinese government to squeeze U.S. companies out of industries such as consumer technology as well as emerging technology?
So I'm going to respond to that, not specifically, but from a more broader perspective. As I mentioned earlier, companies operating in China, whether they're Chinese or otherwise, are subject to different kinds of scrutiny and different requirements than companies that operate in environments that are democratically managed. So any Chinese company is simply in a different position than an American company or European company in terms of what the requirements are on them to assist the Chinese government. Additionally, as we know from Huawei's background and from other Chinese organizations, the Chinese government provides subsidies to their organizations that they feel are vital to their own national or economic security. I'm putting it quite bluntly. They don't necessarily always represent them as subsidies, but Chinese companies can have a leg up, which allows them to provide services and goods at let's just say discount prices compared to those that are produced in countries and by organizations that work in democratic environments.
Well, we appreciate your candid remarks here with us today, and you're taking the time this afternoon. I find that these opportunities fly by in the 45 minutes that we've had, but I want to see if you have any closing thoughts that you want to share with our virtual attendees this afternoon, Connie.
Well, Suzanne, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to just share my thoughts today, and now to share my supply chain bumper sticker thoughts, which I will do to wrap up my recommendations, understanding that all of you who are watching are probably well into the establishment of supply chain capabilities within your own organizations. I will nonetheless lay out my best practices very quickly. Okay. First and foremost, as I said earlier, recognize, acknowledge, and accept that supply chains can be a vulnerability for your organization and prepare yourself to protect yourself. Treat the supply chain threat as a team sport. Team sports always are more effective than scattered efforts when it comes to security. Stay abreast of rapidly changing landscape by knowing the current status of your suppliers. Again, recognizing that that is a heavy lift in this environment. Just as you would with the cyber threat, focus your limited resources on protecting your crown jewels from a supply chain perspective. And finally, and shamelessly, please feel free to take a look at ncsc.gov, because we do have some good capabilities there, some good best practices that we can share with you all. And we do hope that we've done that in a way that is useful to all of your organizations. Let me close, if I may, by thanking all of you who are in attendance today for the fantastic partnership that we in the U.S. government have with the private sector, particularly in the IC. None of us could get our jobs done without you as partners. So thank you very much for the chance to spend a little time with you today.
Well, and we appreciate your sharing your bumper sticker takeaways in closing. It's now my pleasure to introduce INSA Advisory Committee member and my friend, also president of Exeter Federal Solutions, who is going to introduce our moderator today. So Adam Lurie, there you are, we brought you up. I'm turning it over to you now, Adam.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. Exeter Federal Solutions is a proud supporter of INSA and its mission to address our nation's top national security priorities through public-private collaboration. Exeter was founded to help corporations, financial institutions, and government organizations fight financial crime, fraud, corruption, and terrorist financing by introducing technology solutions to help our customers gain a comprehensive picture of their risk profile. Utilizing AI-enabled technology, Exeter is able to comb through millions of data elements, enabling recommendations that ensure more secure operations. With an increasingly global supply chain, safeguarding the data, assets, and infrastructure that make up these complex, interconnected networks are an even more critical component of our national security strategy. Today's discussion on 5G supply chain challenges is a great example of assuring this relevant topic stays at the forefront of the conversation. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's panel discussion. Cleet Johnson is a partner at Wilkinson Barker Nauer LLP, where his practice areas include cybersecurity, data protection, emerging technologies, privacy, and supply chain security. His distinguished career includes a number of senior roles on Capitol Hill, in the national security and intelligence communities, the regulatory arena, executive branch, and the private sector. As the FCC's first chief counsel for cybersecurity, Cleet focused on creating new legal mechanisms for government collaboration with private sector stakeholders to improve the security of communications infrastructure. He last served in government as a senior advisor for cybersecurity and technology at the Department of Commerce, where he was the staff representative for NSC deliberations on cybersecurity, encryption, and other issues emerging at the nexus of digital business and international security.
Adam, thank you so much, and Suzanne and Connie and INSA. I've known INSA for a long time, and back to my time on the Senate Intelligence Committee almost 10 years ago. It's a terrific institution, and we have an incredible discussion to follow on Connie's insights in her discussion with Suzanne a moment ago. And so I just want to, I should start out by saying greetings from rural North Georgia. I'm in the mountains near the Appalachian Trail, which really I think underscores, which is where my family has decamped during the pandemic here, and it really underscores the importance of secure and reliable connectivity in this unprecedented moment. And so before I introduce our distinguished panelists, I want to start off with a poll with an online poll that you can access through your screen, and that gets to that very issue. These are unprecedented times for everyone, and what we want to start this discussion with is with the question of what has helped you cope during the quarantine. These are supplies or activities. Is it online shopping, streaming services like Netflix, Disney Plus, honing your cooking skills, home delivery services, or virtual happy hours? If all of our attendees could make your vote, and we'll close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see. Streaming services, number 1. Honing my cooking skills, number 2. Online shopping, number 3. Home delivery services, number 4. And virtual happy hours, number 5. I would guess that with the possible exception of honing my cooking skills, which could possibly be done in the old-fashioned offline way, but is probably greatly is greatly supplemented by quick YouTube videos and online recipes. Virtually everything that has helped us cope with this pandemic derives from secure, reliable connectivity, and specifically secure, reliable remote connectivity. Again, greetings from near the Appalachian Trail. That's what this is about. And as Connie noted, this is not an academic issue. Secure, reliable connectivity, particularly as we move into the 5G arena, is truly an imperative of modern life. And the reason that will become more of an imperative in the 5G area is, as Connie said, 5G will dramatically increase speeds of connectivity. It will dramatically lower latency to allow functions such as connected cars and telemedicine, and it will dramatically increase the throughput, the numbers of devices that can be connected. In some cases, 10 to 100 times of increase and decrease in latency. So it will produce more data than has ever existed before, and therefore more opportunity for damaging espionage. It will also increase the cyber physical nexus in ways that have never happened before, meaning that a cyber attack can have a physical effect and increase the possibility of sabotage. So any connectivity starts with the supply chain, and that's what we're here today to discuss. We have 4 terrific experts from a very diverse set of perspectives, who I will introduce now, and we'll jump into the discussion. First, Brennan Grignon, who is a senior consultant at LMI, and before that, essentially ran industry outreach for the Undersecretary for Acquisition at DoD. Welcome, Brennan. Second, Catherine Condello, who is not only a senior director for national security and emergency preparedness at CenturyLink. Hi, Catherine. But is also a dear friend and a great lady who I've had the pleasure to work with, and I think 3 or 4 different jobs at this point. Third is Sherry Caddy, who has spent a lot of time in the defense and intelligence community at NSA, and is presently the senior advisor for cybersecurity, energy security, and emergency response at the Department of Energy. Hi, Sherry, and I've had the pleasure to work with her in a number of capacities as well. And finally, Bob Kolaski, who is the first director of the National Risk Management Center at the Department of Homeland Security. And he makes us all call him Mr. Director. So welcome, Bob. And welcome to the group. We unfortunately, Jennifer Lane from the Department of Commerce is not able to join us today. You might have seen in recent news that we'll talk about. The Department of Commerce has been quite busy, and Jennifer is helping lead those initiatives, so she can't be with us today. But I just want to start with this diverse set of perspectives that we have, and I'm going to just jump right in with you guys. But I just wanted to flag for all of our attendees in the portal over to the right of your screen. There's a document that you can access. It's called the Snapshot of the Foundations of the New Federal Regulatory Regime for Communication Security. It's purposely a very busy slide, and basically what I want to do is just put everything that Connie talked about on one sheet of paper and show how it all interrelates. So no, there's not going to be a test on this, but I just want to frame this discussion with we're at the beginning of what is effectively a regulatory regime. In some cases, with the FCC activities, it literally is a regulatory regime. The Commerce Supply Chain rules and the executive order in the past couple of weeks to prohibit transactions with the parent companies of TikTok and WeChat are formal regulatory activities. And then in some other arenas like DoD procurement, DoD's engagement with the standards body ADIS to develop 5G supply chain security, and then in other in the procurement arena, those initiatives are not regulatory, but they certainly have some effect in the real world, and they are, you might say, quasi-regulatory. And then there are some purely voluntary processes like the NTIA software supply chain, called the Software Bill of Materials, software transparency, multi-stakeholder process, that are not regulatory, but certainly will develop best practices that eventually could be leveraged in a regulatory setting. And then finally, the Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, a truly innovative public-private initiative, is co-chaired in part by Bob Kolaski as one of the three co-chairs. The other two are industry representatives. And the task force is developing a whole host of best practices and initiatives that really will inform all of these other areas. So with that, I want to just start our discussion with a round robin and just ask all of our panelists, and Brendan, we can start with you if you like, to articulate what they think the most important initiative in supply chain security in your arena, be it an agency or a sector. What is the most important initiative underway, and how does it interface with other parallel initiatives outside your agency or sector? So Brendan, let's start with you and DoD and the defense industrial base.
Okay, well, thanks, Clete. And hopefully you all can hear me and see me.
We got you.
Okay, so just as context and background, I have actually been working on COVID response for the department since March. So I took a step away from the 5G supply chain activities and have been primarily focused on the department's efforts to support HHS and FEMA in response to the COVID pandemic, which has been an incredible experience, and it just highlights the importance of our ability to understand our supply chains. So whether it is in the national security arena, and we are talking about the supply chain of the manufacturers who create parts and components and systems for our national security operations, which is what I was working on prior to COVID, or it is the fidelity and integrity of the supply chains for our medical resources that enables us to understand how we can best posture the United States to support the American people during a public health crisis that has impacted every single country on this planet. The ability for us to understand our supply chains and how they are connected, the interoperability of those supply chains, our reliance, as Connie mentioned, on both friendly and maybe not so friendly partners and their supply chains, and how that creates an ecosystem that is both connected physically with regards to trade routes and the production of materials and goods and the offering of services, as well as virtually, and how that virtual connection is impacted by new technology like 5G. And so I think that the biggest initiative that the federal government and the private sector really needs to focus on in this space is understanding those connections, having full trust in that supply chain, and understanding where there is a lack of trust, how to mitigate that lack of trust or that risk. In the Department of Defense, I know in my time there prior to working on defense industrial base issues, one of the things that we talked about often was the interoperability with our partners and allies. So when our troops are overseas and we are operating in an environment that is not domestic, we operate very closely with our partners and allies, and they may have different definitions of trust as it relates to 5G than we do. So how do we understand what those definitions of trust are, and how do we mitigate against what we may perceive as risk because of that different definition? So I think the initiatives that we're working on within the private sector as well as within the government to determine visibility, understanding, connectivity, both virtual and physical, and the robustness and the complexity of our supply chains is really critically important in this space.
No, that's a great rundown, and I appreciate how you connected supply chain security with COVID response. And it's something we'll circle back to a little bit later. Catherine, how about you next?
I'm going to speak on behalf of the sector because I'm the vice chair of the Communications Sector Coordinating Council. And when the question is, so what are you focusing on? What's the most important thing, that you're working on with respect to supply chain? I think our response broadly as a sector is, what is it we're not focusing on? We have 5 separate initiatives with the Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, focusing on everything from information sharing to what would be a good template for people who are doing business with the U.S. government to communicate what their supply chain risk management practices are, including as well sort of a short-term, mid-term sort of like supply chain impact of COVID on the ICT space. We are certainly engaged because it's in current play right now on the Hill with supply chain issues, whether it's NDAA or other legislation. Certainly with the Department of Commerce, everything from TikTok, WeChat to the sort of Huawei kind of initiatives. The FCC has a big hand in our space, and so there's a lot of interaction there. Certainly working with DoD, both just sort of the normal sort of vendor contractor kind of relationship, but also more importantly on the cybersecurity maturity model certification programs. So to say that we are not engaged would be completely inaccurate. I find myself, though, sort of as CenturyLink, thinking about supply chain. I find myself sort of having sort of the look ahead, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years kind of, questions about all this focus on supply chain, particularly the nation state related kind of supply chain concerns. I find myself wondering, how does one, and I certainly believe that we CenturyLink and we the sector and industry broadly needs to be fully engaged with governments on these discussions about how do you balance the, I'm going to call it free and open internet, the open marketplace, the digital economy, which has been a major democratic push point, one where you could promulgate sort of values, practices, and approaches in an environment where we're now potentially, and others, not just us, are potentially starting to kind of balkanize both, suppliers, nation state supplies and vendors, and how does that impact sort of the free flowing goods, thoughts, bits, bytes, services, and cultural aspects. So while we may be focusing at any given moment in time on, is this the right widget? Is this the right supplier? Is this the best practice? I think it's really important, and one of the reasons that CenturyLink, certainly plays in the CPAC environment, like Bob Kolosky and departments and agencies broadly, but to sort of look at the implications or the more global implications and the longer term implications of actions taken today. Back to you.
Great, Catherine. I'm quite aware. Catherine and the communication sector are obviously underlie most every sector with regard to connectivity. So it's almost necessarily that necessarily you have to be everywhere all the time. And Sherry, I want to skip over to the energy sector, because just like without connectivity, without connectivity we can't communicate or in any setting. In the same way, without electricity, we don't have connectivity. So I'd love to hear from you on what's going on in the energy sector.
Thanks, Clete. And I think you hit the nail on the head with cross-sector dependencies, which is huge. And it's important to note that 5G is not just a communication sector thing, it's an everybody thing, especially as we move to connect absolutely everything in our Internet of Things. And so we're very keen to understand the dependencies that are forthcoming with the emerging technology, whether it's 5G. I think somebody earlier mentioned blockchain and hyperledger technology, machine learning and AI. All of those things are definitely coming to a sector near you, including the energy sector. So DOE, Department of Energy, is in a great position as a very science-focused agency to really understand some of those technical dependencies, leveraging our wonderful network of national laboratories that just a wealth of great technical expertise in all of these areas to help us both understand the critical technical vulnerabilities and components associated with not just the energy sector, criticality of components, of risk associated with our sector systems, but also the key vulnerabilities, dependencies, cross-sector dependencies that we need to be aware of, especially as we are starting to embark on major technological change. Energy systems are, I think, in my view, a little bit, having worked across many sectors, including the IT comms and defense industrial base, energy systems maybe are a little slightly behind some of the technical innovation space in emerging technologies that we see in the IT sector, for example. But that doesn't mean that those innovations aren't coming here, and they're starting to emerge. So not just are we looking at understanding critical technical vulnerabilities for deployed systems, but how can we really get in front of what we know is coming in terms of technical innovation and the introduction of 5G? How can we work with our industry partners to ensure that those connected components have the best security built in before they get widely deployed, because it's so much easier to fix them before they get out there in a widely dispersed locations rather than trying to fix them after the fact. So we're definitely keen to work with our sector and do our best to secure emerging technologies and make sure that those cross dependencies are well in hand. Back to you.
Right. Oh, thanks, Sherry. And that's a terrific segue to Bob Gillespie, who, and I won't steal your thunder, Bob, but is as the first director of the National Risk Management Center, those cross-sector dependencies and cross-sector risks are exactly what the National Risk Management Center was established to do. So, Bob, I'll turn it over to you. Bob, I don't know if others are having this problem. I am not able to hear Bob, so make sure he's
okay. Try that.
No, there you go. Got it.
I got the practice, please. So anyway, thanks for that. At the National Risk Management Center, we're focused on things that we call strategic risks, and what we're trying to do is bring awareness to strategic risks and get the right people to the table to make a difference in terms of strategic risks. And so, in the context of supply chain and 5G and some of what Connie was talking about, I mean, we see something that is, coming from foreign adversaries, something that is a strategic risk to the nation. But the way you address the strategic risk isn't just through security means; it is through smart economic policy, smart diplomatic policy, trade policy, things like that. And you connect the dots and you make a step to reduce the risk. And so bringing people together who have different levers, making this part of the overall effort is some of what we're trying to do. In terms of your initial question of, what's important right now, or where there's real meaningful difference going on, I will reference the ICT Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force that Catherine and Sherry serve on and the work we're doing there, but Catherine did a good job of the overview there, as well as the work we're doing across the federal interagency in establishing the Federal Acquisition Security Council. And so what's happening in both of those places is enduring partnership between industry and government, a full range of government stakeholders, and partnership across the agencies are coming together to build out capabilities to reduce risk to supply chain. And I think that sort of enduring partnership is, pulling on Connie's theme of team sport, is absolutely important. And through those capabilities, I think you're going to look at success here in a couple years where you see enhanced ability to share information, which I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit. I know that's something that's near and dear to Catherine and Sherry's thinking. So improved information sharing, improved incentives to invest in security and invest in some of the things Brennan was talking about in terms of security and resilience of supply chains, and it makes more business sense. And then bringing those incentives into business decision making and pricing in risk. And that's where, again, going back to the National Risk Management Center, if we reach a point where the security risk that's been taken on by decisions made in our IT and comm space is actually priced in, and there's some transparency and understanding that there's value in companies who are willing to reduce risk, and that gets passed on, and you see that, and there's value in investing in things that are less risky, that have more trust. We get to a point where we've got a higher security barrier from the get-go. So what I'd really like to see coming out of this is you improve information, improve incentives, and you price in the risk, and all of a sudden we're making smarter decisions, even not when security is a first-order consideration. These smarter decisions are being made along the way. We have a more secure IT and comms infrastructure, more secure energy infrastructure, just based on business decisions, and then we layer security on top of that.
That's great. Well, and with that, I would love, and just one other note about our distinguished panelists is that Sherry and Kathy, I see Kathy, what it says on the show. I've known you as Catherine all this time, yeah. Sherry and Catherine were among the three co-chairs of one of the working groups on the Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, which looked at how the government and industry can share concerns that they have about certain suppliers. Would you walk us through where we landed on that working group and how it what the hopes for those recommendations are?
I'll do the first two bases, and then Sherry,
Great.
you can knock us on home. So the Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force has actually been in existence now for two years. And Working Group 1, which is focused on information sharing, sort of spent the first year sort of assessing, how can information be shared, where does information exist, which information would be of value. And what we came to find out was that actually there is a lot of information out there, but you have to look for it. And some of that information is behind a paywall. And so you have to make the risk management decision, is it worth it to go behind the paywall to get that kind of information? But I think one of the more important aspects that get bubbled up at the end of year one was that actually the most important information that would be of value certainly to industry, of course, is the one that's the hardest to do. It's what we call the naming of names problem. So if you've been using a vendor and for whatever reason you don't like that vendor and you just think there's something a little bit wonky there, that's a technical phrase. How do you share the fact that you've just canceled this contract with this vendor who was wonky because it just didn't look right? Well, so the implied assumption was that that's the most valuable information, because if I could say to some other associate of mine or some other company that's in my space, by the way, we had some really wonky and canceled the contract, but just heads up. Well, turns out there's a lot of law associated with not sharing that kind of information. In particular, the name of the person or the name of the company, particularly if you don't have grounded lots of evidence associated with it, because you can be sued. So in year two, we spent a fair amount of time looking at what are the legal impediments, to industry sharing information with either industry or government about perceived wonkiness. And to that end, the task force and the subcommittee that was working on that did actually work with attorneys, Cleat being one of them, and two firms, to be able to sort of put together what we called a placemat for the average person who is trying to determine is it something I can share, should share, want to share, what the legal risks are associated with that. I'll turn it over to you, Sherry, and you can bring it on home.
Okay, thanks. I think just from a government perspective, having spent the last 10 years in the intelligence community, I think a critical finding for me was that despite public musings to the contrary, there is not some giant pile of supply chain intelligence sitting behind some sort of classification wall that is available to share. That I think for me was a critical finding that folks came to on their own discussion to determine that the information that is really most interesting to share is really that ground truth of dealing with specific vendors and understanding when things are going wrong. So that is not classified information, but it's not easy to get to either. And so I think that was a key finding, I think, for government. But then also having spent, as a technologist, having spent more than the past decade on various platforms for information sharing, it's so critical that we really address a lot of the policy barriers and frankly the cultural barriers to sharing information before we start down what seems like the easy path of, hey, let's build platforms and processes to share threat data and information. If no one's going to, it doesn't matter if you build the best platform out there if culturally people aren't comfortable with sharing, if their in-house counsel restrains them from sharing, the best platform in the world isn't going to help. So before we embark on discussing the how do we get information out to people that need it? How do we get that to who needs to see it, get it out in a timely fashion? Addressing those barriers and that the legal impediments, the potentially cultural impediments against sharing is so critical as an upfront activity before we embark further. So I think this is really important information, and we've had some really good findings from the group with the help of some really smart lawyers, including Cleve, of course.
Thanks, ladies. I appreciate that. That was a great rundown. And basically, this basic what Working Group 1 was working on is to address this basic question of, if you see something that looks suspicious or funny or wonky, as Catherine put it, if you see something, what is appropriate to say? Not quite as easy as if you see something, say something, because you don't want to say something in a way that gets you a defamation lawsuit or some sort of tortious interference lawsuit, and particularly because some of these companies are litigious and are not only bad actors, but they can cause trouble in court. So I think that what Catherine and Sherry and their other co-chair, Edna Conway from Microsoft, worked through really moves the ball down the field on how to appropriately do that. And what I'd like to close out this issue, I'd love to hear from Bob and Brennan, maybe Brennan with your former DoD hat on, about the value of that type of engagement with government. If a company that has engineers and salespeople and and other employees maybe throughout the world, and is dealing with maybe dozens, if not hundreds of vendors, if they see something that is not clandestinely collected intelligence, but is just normal course of business, and it looks funny, it looks like something that shouldn't be happening. Bob, can you talk about how you want to use that in either the NRMC's work or in the FAST procurement work? And then Brennan, I'll turn it over to you to hear your perspective on industry engagement from a DoD acquisition standpoint, and how that public-private partnership can work. Bob?
Yeah, sure, Cleve. So, I mean, I agree with the fundamental premise we have here and the premise of your question, which is that, big multinational companies may see things that the intelligence community doesn't see through base of operations, through their own expertise. What we're talking about is incentivizing that information being shared with the U.S. government, and the U.S. government can do other things to push that information out more broadly. We can take steps, and when you reference the FAST, we can take steps to put in exclusion orders in on our own procurement. Prior to the FAST being established in the exclusion order authorities, we had to do this through binding operational directives. DHS's most famous binding operational directive, I think, was banning the use of Kaspersky software U.S. government systems. And when we take those exclusionary steps, we want to make sure that we do that so that there's the information that merits it. There's, you know, a review process from a judicial thing that it can withstand judicial scrutiny. But then we want to be somewhat public of the steps we've taken, because we think that incentivizes and encourages other critical infrastructure companies, state governments, private sector critical infrastructure companies to look at what the federal government's doing, and maybe they'll follow suit based on the evidence that we've been able to gather, some of which comes in through industry. And so I think, you know, that just allows us to sort of push out a broader trust judgment in a way that critical infrastructure government are taking less risk, to use all my favorite words there. And even when we don't put an exclusion order in place, you know, using the network of information sharing analysis centers, information sharing analysis organizations, to push out broadly that we have some concerns about a certain software, a certain hardware, a certain vendor that sells that information that we, you know, we could glean from the private sector. Again, we have the ability to amplify, you know, concerns about sources of risk. You know, something that we published through those channels, you know, some concerns we have with some of the software used to put in place DJI drones. We are not saying don't buy DJI drones. We are saying that if you are using DJI drones, there are concerns with some of the software. DoD's taken steps related to that. We urge that these are best practices to make sure that spilling over some of that concerns is not giving, you know, some backdoor access to information. So that, you know, whether it's exclusion orders or whether it's guidance documents of how you mitigate potential sources of risk, again, a lot of that information comes from the private sector first, and then we can push it out.
Great. Brendan, can you talk a little bit about the value of industry engagement in DoD supply chain work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I just want to preface this with, these are my own personal views from my experience, not the views of the federal government. So, in 2018, we delivered a report, an industrial base assessment of the health of the defense industrial base to the president. It was requested through an executive order. I myself and Eric Tuning, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Industrial Policy at the time, brought together a group of interagency experts on the visibility or lack thereof that the department and the interagency and our industry partners honestly have in their supply chain. I know there are many folks in the audience who work for different companies who will probably push back on this comment and say that my company X can do industrial base supply chain for all the tiers of every single fighter aircraft that the Air Force uses. And I can tell you with great authority, the answer to that is you cannot. But you're trying, and that helps. We have recognized, both within the government as well as with industry, that there is the lack of visibility into our supply chain is one of our key vulnerabilities. And that is why it is critically important to work together. Bob's comment on the Kaspersky effort was one of those areas that really highlighted a lack of understanding from industry on what implications that had on their operations. And so a lot of the work that's now being done and has been done over the past few years is industry owning more of the visibility of their supply chain beyond their tier 1 or tier 2 suppliers, because in a lot of the platforms, the end items that they provide to the federal government, whether it's an aircraft carrier or a tank or a munition, you will have hundreds of suppliers in that supply chain. So working with industry to ensure that they understand the criticality of them understanding their supply chain, and then as the federal government being the objective third party that can own that data and be able to share it and protect it and analyze it in such a way that it doesn't create a lack of competition, which is also critically important to our ecosystem, is I think a very strong path forward. And what Catherine and Sherry had mentioned with regards to the supply chain task force and how they're looking at gathering and sharing that information and having the federal government be the coalescer of that data so that industry can share it willingly, freely, with the understanding that it will be protected and not used against them in source selection, and not used in such a way that will include competition is an important aspect of all of this work that I think is a great step forward in this space.
Great. That I think that rounds out that issue, and I want to kind of piggyback on an attendee question to tie this together with COVID response. A lot of what we've been talking about, and a lot that's there that's in the background, if you're talking about a Huawei, ZTE, Kaspersky, is the potential bad acts that could come from a suspect supplier. But there's another element of it that we've learned in the COVID era about availability and resiliency, and just-in-time delivery is great when things can be delivered just in time. And so I just want to use a question from the audience. This is Dr. Lenora Gant from Howard University School of Business. What are the impacts of the supply chain if the supply chain lacks resiliency and flexibility? And so I might want to start with Bob, because the NRMC, the National Risk Management Center, and also the Supply Chain Task Force has undertaken some really important efforts in the past few months to respond to this in real time. And so with no further ado, Bob, I'll turn it over to you, and then want to get some other folks' take on this as well, because in different ways, all of you are working on this in the COVID response. So, Bob, what about resiliency and flexibility in the supply chain?
Sure. I mean, let's be quite simple, and I think the pandemic has allowed us to be a little bit simple and understand things. You need to get some good or some core commodity from somewhere to then get it to your customer, right? And so what we've learned and what we've been working on a lot at in the National Risk Management Center is the ability of things to move and the ability of people to work and the general availability of the thing, which now could be limited because there's more demand for it, all contribute to the risk here. And what we've seen in the pandemic is, countries are going to take different steps. Businesses are going to go to different things to mitigate the actual health impacts of the pandemic out there that could have impact on your supply chain. And so, what we've tried to do is, to the ability possible, keep transportation networks flowing, keep the ability of essential workers to work, and provide guidance that will help us so that commodities can get there. But if the commodities are coming from a long way away, if there's going to be pressure, if there's a global demand surge and you don't have an ability to sort of move to the top of the line to get to those commodities, then all of a sudden you have supply chain risk built in there. So I think some of the policy solutions that we'd like to see coming out of this is, maybe have supply sources from places where we are closer in, where there's more trust that the commodities can flow from there, that there's going to be less problems internationally working through that. Maybe have a diverse set of supplies, incentivize some paying into resilience so that you have backup systems there. And then, from the analytic end, can we sort of identify commodities that are subject to potential demand surges and incentivize, more industrial policy around producing more of those things, having backup capability, not just on the business side of it, of knowing where you're going to get the backup capability, but producing more things. And so I think there is a whole industrial policy conversation to be had about where can you stimulate more production or faster production for backup. And when we have a Defense Production Act debate, that's what we're trying to do. And you're going to see us coming out next year analytically with some things where we think there's just not enough supply, and start to have the conversation analytically. From policy, what can you do when there's not enough supply is something that's really important.
Right.
Cleve, can I just add on to that?
No, please jump in. And I was going to ask Brennan, Catherine, and Sherry to provide your perspective from those different sectors on this same question.
So the DoD has been doing assisted acquisition for HHS and executing Defense Production Act and CARES Act funding to supply critical medical resources. One of the key aspects of this, though, to go back to the important relationship between government and industry, is that the government makes up a very small percentage of the overall market. So if you look at things like PPE or ventilators, et cetera, the demand for the strategic national stockpile is less than 5%. So it's critically important that industry also sends a signal to these suppliers that they will buy domestically produced items, because without industry's engagement and involvement, there will be no market, no business case for long-term industrial expansion efforts within the United States, because the cheapest price, which will be provided by a supplier overseas, will eventually win out. And that's a critical aspect of this conversation that needs to continue throughout the next year.
Right.
So I think one of the silver linings I see from the COVID crisis is, of course, bringing supply chain issues to the front burner. You know, for those of us who've been working in it a long time, it's good to see our favorite topic on everyone's minds. And I think, you know, one of the interesting aspects of the crisis has been we've had quite a bit of national investment on illuminating the supply chain to better understand where the bottlenecks are, where the issues are. That has been directed, of course, at things like ventilators or reagents or cotton swabs, certain types of commodities. However, the tools that we have invested in, that the federal government has invested in to illuminate the supply chain, to be able to trace the provenance of various subcomponents of products, can be retooled to look at different kinds of supply chain. So I think there's an opportunity to leverage the investment made in illuminating the supply chain for COVID-related materials, and look at how can we then retool those tools and procedures that have been built to look at components in the ICT supply chain and energy components in particular. And I think there's an opportunity for national investment there. Great.
Catherine?
So I agree with everything everyone has said in terms of aspects to look at. It's a very, what was the phrase that was used, complicated issue. But I kind of want to focus on something that was just really sweet spot COVID, if you will. And I'm not talking about PPE or ventilators, but I'm talking about the fact that we as a nation and globally, you know, the digital economy has increasingly relies on, you know, just in time, you know, and just in time makes things more cost efficient and more effective, and, you know, you're more competitive in the marketplace. And I think it's fair to say that the large entities, you know, like essentially, you know, we already implement geographic diversity. I don't get everything from Montana, nor do I get everything from one nation state. You know, we have a global distribution environment. But during COVID, everyone was sick. Everyone was sequestered. Everyone couldn't go into work. And so the whole time lag in terms of the manufacturing of the chip, which then goes to the next part, which goes to the next part, which goes to the next part, got lulled and got staggered. Now, in the case of comms, and I know because we've just finished getting a ton of briefings in a different environment on this sort of thing, you know, most communication companies are building today and have already ordered a year ago what they expect the capacity to be a year from now. So we're already kind of ahead of the game. Nonetheless, you know, the fact that there were lags in the whole process because everybody was down definitely upsets sort of the just-in-time equation. And so I think, you know, academically speaking, you know, particularly if you're a sector, you're not comms, and you're someone who really does work in a just-in-time environment from concept to delivery, it's less than 30 days. That's like the optimal, you know, that's the Shangri-La of just-in-time kind of theories, you know, and operates in a lot of businesses. I think the opportunity to sort of step back and think a little more strategically then about what's the mitigation for a business that is hyper reliant on just-in-time to be competitive or to deliver its service or to do the right thing, has an opportunity to be sort of reassessed, if you will, academically and operationally.
Yeah. Those are all great points. I want to follow that up with a slightly different question, another question from the audience. This is from Carrie McCarthy. And the question is, because a diverse supply chain is often more costly than just sole sourcing, how do we incentivize the industry to address and balance costs versus national security when many companies' business models or customer bases are not largely public sector, and where private sector is often not as sensitive to national security concerns. Now, I can sense that the premise of that question is that that industry might not want to pay for security and pay for a diverse and trusted market. I'd love to hear, Bob, can you kick us off, and then I would want to hear Catherine's perspective from a big carrier, and then of course Brendan and Sherry, if you have anything to add, please do so. This applies to virtually every industry. Diversity in the supply chain, Bob.
Sure. I don't know that there's a great insight other than putting more information and transparency into the costs of lack of security and the costs of risks being taken on, and trying to understand and push that as something that businesses, that the government cares to pay for and businesses care to pay for, and therefore the people they're paying to do business with have to have a certain level of security. That's what we're starting to build here. That comes with, again, transparency and information, and then an understanding of what good security looks like. So you actually are assured that if somebody's demonstrating security, it is good security, and that does reduce costs long term, right? If you don't lose information, if you don't have to pay for, something that comes because there's a breach in a system, you're saving costs, and therefore you're paying for the security, and that's what we're trying to build toward. I think the government as a buyer, DoD as a buyer, will continue to try to push in that direction. But I think so too will big companies like Catherine and Primes who are paying for things like that. It's going to make some things maybe more expensive at the start, but hopefully that leads to some innovation and it saves money in the long term. Makes things better investments. Things like that. So I'm optimistic that again, we're going to get there with the pricing and risk. There's still, is possibility of a delta where there's a national security reason to go a lot further than a private company might go for. And at that point, the government has to figure out kind of the right way, whether you want to call it a regulatory framework, whether you want to call it incentives, or whether you want to call it, fund, or whether you want to go fund R&D, but figure out some way to fill the gap if we as the government see national security risk. But that's how we're thinking about it.
Yeah. Catherine, what about from the industry perspective?
I think that certainly with industry, certainly within CenturyLink, we are not inclined to sole source anything. We don't find sort of philosophically, academically, really, that any kind of sole source anything is cheaper. You end up being, held hostage, if you will. So I think the economists would say that the minimum that you need for competition is 3, maybe 5, depends on what you're talking about. Okay, but it's where you sort of and in the telecom space, we like to have a minimum of 3, optimally let's say 5, to sort of act as a vendor base for any given whatever, so that they can compete for my business, and that competition for my business sort of contributes to the whole Moore's law of things, so things are faster, better, cheaper, whatever, and that all ended up being better for me, but ultimately it's better for my customers. So I think that we take more the point of view that says, look, the more vendors for any given whatever, the better. And the best way to do that, at least in the IT hardware software space, is going to be through standards, and then the pile-on of interoperable standards, so that I can use his router or the other person's router. So I can use this software stack, or I can use that software stack, or I can use So my point is to be able to be interoperable, not built on standards, not only provide this more diversity in terms of users, but it provides a market opening for people who only want to do half of the stack and not the full stack. I can, as long as I'm interoperable with the top part of the stack, then I can compete at the bottom level of the stack. And so you'll see stuff in 5G about open RAN kind of networks, where they're trying to make them standards-based, which makes them transparent. as well as interoperable, because once you try and swap out vendor A for vendor B, and you find that there's an interoperability problem, that points directly at, well, let's take a look what's going on between A and B, which once again, provides transparency into what the vendors are doing and provides a means of getting supply chain risk information. So since CenturyLink particularly, we're not the wireless guys, we're not. And so 5G to us is, interesting, cool, wireless, but in our mind, 5G is not just the wireless space that everybody's talking about, which by the way is totally cool, but the fact it's an absolutely foundational change in how telecom networks are going to deliver services. The latency, the processing power, the whatever. And our experience to date has been not that the wireless guys aren't doing cool things. I'm not trying to say that, but where we're seeing all the activity is on the enterprises leveraging 5G processing speeds, latency, compute kind of capabilities to make their shoe business, their bakery, their whatever they're doing faster, better, more effective. So for us, when we're looking at 5G, where we're going to see, I think the UN says there are 100, somewhere between, let's say roughly 150 million businesses globally. I think it's underestimated, but who am I going to tell the UN that they're wrong? Okay. If we say that 150 million businesses are going to leverage sort of 5G capabilities or processing capabilities, whatever, to make their business better, then we definitely want it to be standards-based, transparent, and interoperable, because if I'm trying to connect the shoe store in Hong Kong with the shoe store who's doing something similar in another place, and I want them to be able to run across my network, I'm looking for some level, not the intellectual property part, but some level of interoperability so that I can serve that customer as well as the other customer equally well and in a secure fashion. So, for me, the supply chain thing in terms of competition is, no, I want a competition. I want as many competitors as possible, but I want them to be operating on sort of a level playing field, a standards-based, and to the degree possible, certainly for telecom, an interoperable basis.
So basically, if it's standards-based and interoperable, it leads to diversity, security, and because of diversity and security, lower costs. That's the ideal. Brennan and Sherry, anything you want to add to that discussion?
So I think this question really gets to the heart of the national discussion that we're having. And having worked with industry for many, many years now, I'm well familiar with the dialogue around, hey, this is about my bottom line, and I'm solely focused on cost. And that's really, not a full picture. And I think, we certainly want to encourage everyone to include the private sector to look at risk in a holistic way. And how can we have a discussion about really including more factors associated with national security risk into your business enterprise risk decision, because that is a composite of many things. And we have certainly at the national level, at the federal government level, have taken the first step in that regard with, after the Secure Technology Act and the stand up of the Federal Acquisition Security Council. The whole point of that is to create national security risk as a co-equal factor in federal procurement, to demonstrate, at least for the federal government, that this has to be considered at an equivalent level of other traditional factors in acquisitions, and we have to start looking at the federal enterprise at a risk level. It's not just about protecting or having extra protections for the defense and intelligence communities, but recognizing the interconnectivity of all federal systems. And we need to look holistically. We need to make sure, to Bob's point earlier with the binding operational directive on Kaspersky, I don't want Kaspersky in any networks, not just the defense and intelligence community enterprise, but anywhere. And my private sector partners that I depend on, I want them to mitigate that risk as well. And so it's a joint conversation, but I think that holistic, taking into account all of the different factors that comprise risk is where the conversation continues, and where I think we have work to do. And we've taken the first steps to look at that enterprise level risk on the federal government side with the Federal Acquisition Security Council.
Yeah, and I would just add so in some sectors, like in the defense industrial base, the sole source is a challenge, has been a challenge for a number of years, mainly based on the fact that there are very niche components and parts that are needed for some of the platforms and systems. To Catherine's point, in the telecommunications space, you are in full and open competition with everyone, and you want interoperability, and you want diversity of suppliers in order to drive innovation and price competitiveness. I think the other thing that industry is aware of much more so now than we were, say, 5, 10, 15 years ago, is we now have data around the cost to companies of intellectual property by, for example, the Chinese government, and being able to quantify that cost over time to the ability of businesses to protect their intellectual property, which is their competitive edge, now provides a better framework around which to do analysis for the business case for security. And I think that with more and more data like that, it will help drive the conversation around the cost of security and the need for ensuring that there is a secure environment in which your businesses operate.
That's a terrific discussion of these issues, and I just unfortunately we've run out of time. There are a couple more questions from the audience that I just asked the folks that want to follow up with us. You know how to find us through ENSA. We would be delighted to continue the discussion, and I wish we could. This is something we could have a day-long conference on and still not reach the bottom of all the issues. But I just want to thank Brennan, Catherine, Sherry, Bob, Mr. Director. My apologies, Bob. I do want to thank you all for a terrific discussion. We really covered these issues from a host of different angles, and there's much more to talk about. The good news is we're all busy, and we're going to keep working on these issues. So I just want to thank ENSA and the sponsors again. And with that, we'll thank all the panelists and turn it over to Suzanne. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Counselor.
Thanks, Cleet.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cleet, and all of our esteemed panelists. As you mentioned, Cleet, I think this topic is one that there's a definite thirst out there for. This is our second time this summer hosting a panel and keynote focused on supply chain. And so I think there will be a part 3 coming sometime to you all in the fall. So again, appreciate everyone's time this afternoon, as well as our virtual attendees. For all of you who are watching online, thank you for joining us. And of course, I'd like to thank GDIT and Exeter Federal Solutions for supporting this program this afternoon. When the webinar ends, we would really appreciate you all taking a few moments to fill out the survey, letting us know what you thought about the discussion and who and what you would like to hear about in the future. And finally, we hope you will join us at one of the upcoming events that I am going to briefly outline for you. As you can see, we have a very robust lineup coming up on August 26th. We will host both the Republican and Democratic budget directors of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence for a discussion about congressional priorities for the IC. This event is gratis for INSA members as well as our government partners. Then on September 10th, we will hold our inaugural leadership luncheon, where we will honor outgoing DIA Director Robert P. Ashley for his decades of service to our nation. And finally, on September 16th through 18th, we will hold our Virtual Intelligence and National Security Summit in partnership with AFCEA International. Details can be found at www.intelsummit.org or on our website, and you can find the full lineup of virtual events there as well. This concludes today's program. It does feel as though it is an abrupt goodbye, but thank you again to Connie, our panelist, as well as Cleet. Stay safe and healthy, and everyone, please have a wonderful afternoon.